Okay. Let me give the theoretical, then we'll go for the practical, what we required. Okay. Let me go for my notes. Come on. Let me draw the diagrams. Okay. This is important for a DC. Third one, third two. So this is the domain controller. TRO. Okay. Yeah, let me go for the definition of the always on AG. So always on AG introduced in the SQL Server 2012 uh, version. Like the always on AG feature is not available on the 2008 R2, 2008 or 2005 or previous versions. But log shipping, mirroring, replication, and clustering features are available from the 2005 or 2000 onwards. But in the mirroring, not mirroring, in the log shipping, what I meant to say, high availability, like always on AG, always on availability was introduced from the 2012 onwards. The 2012 onwards means like SQL Server 2012 version, it was introduced. Okay. So it is a kind of like a feature that providing from the based upon the SQL Server edition. So the Microsoft is not giving the feature for all the editions. This feature is giving from only for standard edition and developer edition and as well as the enterprise. So we have a other editions, but those editions always an is not giving. So here the always an is, let me go for a small note back. So always an is AOAG is introduced or enable or enter used from SQL Server 2012 and 2012 onwards. Okay, but this was only for enterprise, only for enterprise, then standard and developer edition. Okay, so it's only available for enterprise and standard and enterprise. But what they did, enterprise uh, is giving the full pack full pack features for AOAG. But standard, it is giving standard AOAG setup, not for full pack. Okay, we can discuss like what is the full pack features and FUTURES. Full pack features and standard availability like groups. Uh, so the thing is like AOAG introduced from the SQL Server 2012 and 2012 onwards. It's only for the enterprise and standard and developer edition. So developer also is kind of a full pack. As we mentioned, developer edition should not be used in the production operations. We can go for only development internal purpose only. Now the always on uh, high availability is now always on is kind of like a we can call like a high availability disaster recovery. Okay, it's not only like a high availability, it is kind of like a disaster recovery. Disaster recovery means like a, if something goes wrong in the one region or that particular instance, our SQL server will be available on the other region. So think about like a log shipping and mirroring. Those are only for high availability, not for the disaster recovery. Why? Because if something goes wrong with one instance, those instance is not going to up and running for the other region, or maybe uh, other regions means graphically the same data center, or maybe uh, other data center. But always energy is kind of like a disaster recovery. If something goes wrong, that particular instance, uh, or region or VM, the we have a database copy will available in the other region. Okay, and we can bring up the databases online based upon which we configured. So here the thing is like the difference is like always on easy and other things. The always on easy not only high availability, it is a kind of like a disaster recovery. So let me go for the check here. What is disaster recovery? How AOAG will give compared to compared to mirroring or SQL failover clustering. So we go for mirroring. What is mirroring? Limited, no storage dependency. Yes. Yeah. So disaster recovery means like a if you go for like a clustering, like let's take it the clustering. Suppose here we have a outage. Okay. If you outage happening, what will happen? We are keeping the data in the shared disk. That means what are the disk we are keeping? That region is crashed. The entire VM is crashed. So we cannot able to fail over. Why? Because the data relying on the our shared disk, right? The shared disk is not available. Then we cannot fail over. So the clustering, why it is not a providing disaster recovery means the disk are shared, that will only available on the one particular server holding. So if this particular VM entire crashed, means like a entire region is crashed. So here uh, because what are the disk are coming from the clustered storage LANs. So just we attached here. Suppose VM is down means the VM we are not able to connect, but in the backend storage will be available, right? So that can be moved here. But the storage LANs, what we are keeping that data center is crashing. Okay. So what are the disk and the storage we are keeping in the data center that is crashed? Then our storage won't move, right? So that is the reason our uh, clustering is not providing the disaster recovery, but that is providing the high availability if something goes wrong with the VM. So disaster recovery means like if something goes wrong in the data centers, something like floods or power outage or maybe entire something happen in that particular region. So then entire the data, like VM is not able to connect, network is not able to connect, and storage also not able to connect, because entire our data is relying on keeping into the one shared disk that is not available. But how the always energy availability is providing? So why we can call like a always availability disaster recovery? So let me go for the here. So in the always energy, there is no necessity to keep the disk as a cluster disk. We can keep like a dedicated standalone like a disk. This is the instance. This is the instance. Okay. So here we have a database. We have a database. We have a database. We have a database. So here we have one more called like a availability group. I will explain. So now we are discussing about the disaster recovery. How the always availability providing the disaster recovery. So the disaster recovery means like the disks are I'm keeping here data. Okay, I'm keeping here. So here my prod one is located on the my prod is the located on east ES2. Okay, east ES2 region. So what about the east ES2 paired region? East ES2 paired region means like if something goes wrong east ES2, what are the nearest data center? Okay, what are the like network, what I meant to say, latency will less. Why? Because my entire business running on the east region. Suppose east region, what are the I'm holding the data center is crashing. So my business will be running on the east region. But what are the I'm keeping in the resource? That building was crashed. Okay. So then we need to maintain one more copy to up and running, right? So what we're going to do, the secondary server, the paid region is a central ES, central ES. So maybe here the both prod and prod 2 we can keep in the same region data center or maybe different data centers. So that is called like a graphical geo cluster. Okay, graphical geo cluster means like a this VM having, don't confuse, but end of the class we'll get uh, some clarification. Okay, what is the normal clustering and what is the geo clustering? Okay, so normal clustering means like both prod 1 and prod 2, both are in the same network. So same network means same virtual network. That means same subnet. So think like in the internet in the India, they are in the one subnet. So my one data server having here like Mumbai, one more server like keeping into the one more location called like a Bangalore. But graphically both are in the same region, so the network will be same. So that time you can call like a normal cluster. But my data center one is on the Mumbai, but one more server I'm going to keeping into the China or maybe Sri Lanka or maybe US. So that time what will happen? Our virtual network will be say different and the graphically regions are different. So that time what will happen? This VM will have this will VM having one VNet. This VM having VNet. Okay. So if it is the same region, then VNet will be same. But if it is a different region, the VNet will be different. And what are the IP address? What are the IP address? Okay, which you are going to do? Like if the same region or same region or same region region same region or same VNet. So then IP ranges and subnets within the subnet. So here the IPs are both this VM IP and this VM IP. Like, let me go for here IPs. IPs. So within the region or same data center, that means the subnet will be same and IPs are within the subnet. So these things will take care from the Windows and network team, but database team we need to understand. The thing is like if the same region or same data center, that cluster setup we can call like a normal cluster. But what is the geo cluster? So geo cluster means like a the virtual network will be different from one node to another node, and each computer will have different subnet. So this IP, this IP one subnet, this will IP one subnet, this will IP one subnet, and within the this subnet IP for the VM. Here also this particular VM one subnet and this VM also within this VM within this subnet IP. So that time we can call like a this cluster setup called like a geo cluster. So geo cluster means like a one computer will having the one subnet and another computer will having to the another subnet, and the both will be and both will be both will be both will be configured in the clustering. Both will be configured in the clustering. So both will be configured in the clustering. Configuring in the clustering. Both will be configured in the both will be configured in the Windows clustering. Okay. Here subnets are different for both VMs. So that time we can call like a graphical uh, clustering. So sometimes graphical cluster will create because of the region outage. If you want to like a suppose primary and secondary, I configured in the same region. If I get a region outage, my entire business will down, right? So that time we can go for the geo clustering, and in the geo clustering, what are the IP address and what are the subnets are assigning. Both VMs are the dedicated VM and dedicated subnets, and both will be joining into the Windows clustering. Okay. So in the geographical cluster, in the future, like upcoming another 10 to 15 minutes, we can see the listener. So that listener will having the two IP address. So here, if with the same uh, subnet and same region, the generally we can see the a listener as a one. But if you going for the geo cluster or multi subnet, okay, multi subnet cluster, we can call like a geo cluster. So that may be same region or different region, but if VMs are configured in the multi subnet. Multi subnet means one computer having one subnet and another computer having another subnet. So that clustering we can call like a geo clustering. And if you configure the always an AG in the multi subnet or geo cluster, at that time what will happen? What will happen? What will happen? Come on, come on. What will happen? So, listener LIS T L I LIS T LIS T listener. So the listener, the same subnet. Then we have only one. We have only one IP, one one IP, and one DNS or ELS name. Okay. So in the same subnet, the listener will have only one IP and one LS name. Suppose my cluster is like a multi subnet. Multi subnet. My cluster is a Windows cluster is a uh, Windows multi subnet. Then what will happen? Listener LISTENER listener. So the listener will having two IP address. Listener will having two IP address. One is from one subnet, and another one is another subnet. So this is the key point. So if the Windows team configured the always and edge clustering with a single subnet cluster, then the listener will have only one IP address we need to request. Okay, that also they will provide the within the subnet range. So we need to request them, and they only provide the IP address based upon the availability IP available on the that particular subnet range. So here the listener IP address we cannot decide. I need this IP address. I need this number from the DB team. We cannot decide, but the thing is like we can request the listener IP address to the Windows or network team. What they can do, they can check from the their end. Why? Because VM having one IP address and another VM having one IP address and application server also one IP address. So, but all these servers are configured in the one subnet, right? So application server and database servers will take the IP address from the one subnet. So then what they will do, they will give the subnet, like they will give the IP address which is available on the that particular subnet range. So suppose this VM having IP address 10.108 dot 256 dot something I'm giving again 103. Okay, here I'm giving the same subnet 110.10.108 dot 256 dot 103. So here I have one application server. Okay, here I have one application server. I have one application server. I have one application server. And that application server IP address is 10.108.256.104. So like that, we have a different of application servers and different of VMs. So they will assign from the Windows team and network team, they will assign the IP address. So if you think like my database VM IP address 103 and another here is wrong. It's a 104. Okay. I will get like a 104. I given wrong here. Here 105. Okay. So 103, 104, and 105. Let me give for 10.108 dot 256.105. This is the application server. So suppose if they have any a load balancer and if they have any front end configurations and if you have any other VMs then what they will do, they will allocate the IP address. So from the DB perspective, what we can do, we have the access the virtual computers. So if you log into the computers, we can see the our IP address, right? Here this computer 103, this computer 104. So maybe I can use 105 for listener configurations. So if you take 105, okay, without getting the IP address from the 105, if you assume if you take the 105 IP address, and if you try to configure that IP address while configuring the listener, what will happen in the backend? In the backend, in the backend, while configuring the listener, in the backend, let me go for in the backend, what will happen? This listener, I'm going to create like a this create like a AOAG ELS. So once you creating the listener in the domain control, what will happen? There will be computer object will create. Okay, using the our resident name, and it will give the IP address like a 10 like 10 dot 10. Let me go. So here we have a prod 01, prod 02, and application server, right? So in the domain control, what will happen? In the computer object will be available in the domain controller. In the our DC, what will happen? Prod 01, prod 01, and IP address will map here 10.108.256.103. And we have one more computer join this domain, right? So that particular domain controller, what will happen? We have a prod 02 IP address 10.108.256.104 will be there. Okay. So in the domain controller, one more computer object will be application server, which we have. So it will like a application server, app db something, app application server, that IP address 10.10.108.256.10105. Okay, this is the one computer object will create. So apart from that, what will happen here while Windows team creating, right? Windows cluster. So we are going to provide the Windows cluster name, right? Name of the Windows cluster. So name of the Windows cluster. So this also required one IP. Okay. So once we like Windows team configure the Windows cluster, the Windows cluster name like a uh, uh, Windows cluster name like a Wind class prod 01. Then what will happen? It will also one IP address it will take within the range. So suppose like 10.10.108.256.101. So what are the like a computers computer names and application names like application VM name and Windows cluster? If we have physically, we are seeing right. Once we have here, automatically in the domain controller, there is a computer object will be created. That computer name and as well as IP address. Computer name and IP address. And application and IP address. So while joining the Windows cluster, what will happen? We can able to see the Windows cluster in the our database server when you open the failover cluster, but we cannot see the IP address. But while configuring the Windows cluster, they will give the one IP address while configuring the Windows cluster. So here Windows cluster name and IP address will be here. So now the thing is important is from the DB perspective, the people will fail configuring the listener. Okay, why? Because in the domain controller, what are the like computers? what are the objects we are creating. That respect to object will be created in the domain controller, and one IP address will be presented. So uh, Windows cluster, Windows team will take care while creating the Windows cluster. Automatically, one computer object will be created, and as well as the one IP address will map it to the here. So from the DB team, in the process of the configuring the listeners, so what will happen? The listener IP address should be given to the Windows team. We cannot assume and take it. Why? Because if you take any IP address of this already using IP address, then what will happen? Our SQL server, like a Windows cluster and SQL server, will try to create the computer object in the domain controller. Then what it will do? It will try to allocate that particular IP address. If the IP address already using for other computer, then listener will fail. That is a one scenario. The second scenario is like our listener, whenever giving the listener, the computer object will be needs to create, right? So that means in the back end, our SQL server and Windows cluster can able to communicate to the domain controller, and it able to create the computer object. So here, when we giving the listener name, who is going to create the computer object? So the computer object is creating from the Windows cluster. That Windows cluster will have sufficient permission on the domain controller to create the computer object. So in the process of the configuring the always and availability, if you're not able to configure the listener, there are two things. One is what are the IP address we are giving? That IP address already using by other resources. The second reason is like our Windows cluster is not able to doesn't have permission to create the computer object on that particular OU. OU means like user assignments computer objects. So that particular domain controller is not able to create the computer object. So for that reason, what we need to do, we need to guide the Windows team. Boss, this is the Windows cluster prod 01. This prod 01 Windows cluster have sufficient permission to create the computer object and delete the computer object, and that they required some read, write, and full control on this particular area. So that what Windows team they will do, they will go to the particular domain controller, and they will go to the computers. From there, they will search this cluster, and they will give the read and write and computer object permissions. So I will give the document, and we can show practically where we need to go for this Windows cluster giving permissions. So now this is the kind of a listener. Now the thing is here I'm not going to for any theoretical. Okay, this is the background configurations how to configure the listener, but I will give the theoretical also. Okay, now this is the listener for the subnet. It's a same subnet. Okay, but if you go for multi-subnet, I mentioned that listener will have must be two IP address. Why? Because one IP address we have to take from the one subnet, and one more IP address we need to take from another subnet. So that what will happen here, the multi-subnet, what will happen? AOAG LS, it will map the two IP address like 10 dot 10 dot 108 dot 256 dot 109. Okay, this IP address from the one subnet, and another subnet from the another subnet 10 dot 108 dot 256 dot. They will provide with the ranges that may be 115 or something, but this IP address will provide the our Windows team. So in the multi subnet, in the single subnet, one listener will having one IP address. Here in the domain controller, one computer object will create and only one IP address will allocate. But coming to the multi subnet, what will happen while creating the listener? We going to provide the two IP address in the listener configurations. So we have to initially give one IP address and again the same uh, uh, panel we have to go for add one more IP that is from the different subnet. Once we given that, in the backend, one listener DNS name will create, but two IP address will map it to the that particular always NAG. And here the thing is like the two IP address are not always online. One will be offline, one will be online. These things I will explain. Okay, when will be uh, one IP address will be online, another IP address will be offline. So that based upon the our primary node. Okay, availability group owner based upon the subnet node owner, that IP address will be online, remaining IP address will be offline. So generally people will get confused if the configured on the always energy geo cluster in the listener resource. We can see one IP address online and another IP address will be offline. Why? Because one our always energy one IP address will be online, the respect of the subnet. Why? Because my listener is pointing to the one subnet. Suppose if my always energy fail out to another group, that time what will happen? Our network is changing, right? Network subnet is changing, right? So our VM computer network is changing. So that scenario, previously, what are the subnet IP that will go for offline, and what are the subnet range to the computer for another node, that listener IP address will come to the online. So these major things you need to observe. Don't confuse. Don't bring online in the geo cluster AOAG listener. In the geo cluster listener, one IP address always offline, one will be online. So this is the kind of a key points for listener. So why? Because generally people are fail from the listener concept. So when we going to use single IP address for the listener configurations in the same subnet. If you go for multi subnet or geo cluster, we are going to use two IP address for the listener. One is from the one subnet, another one is for the another subnet. So this is the listener. Now we'll go for the theoretically for the always energy concept. Then theoretically, how we are going to configure the always energy. Then we'll see the practically. Let me stop the recording. Then I will go for the components of the always energy. Once the components are discussed, then we will go for the technical steps in the theoretically how we are going to do. Let me stop the recording.